Of all of our special senses, vision is probably the most precious to all of us. It's extremely important to our survival as humans because it allows us to see and to view dangerous objects in our surroundings and to take action to keep ourselves safe. But think of all that you do with your eyes. You watch videos when you're studying for anatomy and physiology. You see the faces of the people that you love. You drive and keep yourself safe and take actions based on what your eyes detect. So vision is extremely important to us in our daily life. More than half of the sensory receptors in the human body are located in the eyes, and an extremely large part of the cerebral cortex is devoted to processing visual information. So the eyes are responsible for the detection of visible light, which is the part of the electromagnetic spectrum with wavelengths ranging from about 400 to 700 nanometers. Now, what does that mean? That means that there is a part of light spectrum wavelengths that we can see that we refer to as visible light. That visible light exhibits colors. So the color of the light depends on the wavelength. For example, a light with a wavelength of about 400 nanometers we detect as violet. A light that has a wavelength of 700 nanometers is red. An object can absorb certain wavelengths of visible light, but it reflects other wavelengths. So if an object appears green, then it's because it reflects most of the green light and absorbs most of the others. So we see those light waves that are reflected and we see green. If something appears white, it's because it reflects all of the wavelengths of visible lights. But on the other hand, if an object appears black, it's because it absorbs all of those visible light rays. So before we get into a discussion of vision and the special sense of vision and how we process that, how we receive that stimulus and how we process it, let's look at some of the accessory structures of the eye. These include the eyelids, the eyelashes, the eyebrows, the lacrimal glands and apparatus or the tear-producing structures, and some of the muscles associated with the eye. So the upper and lower eyelids protect and shade the eye. So protect the eye when we're sleeping, protect the eye from excess light, from things getting into the eye, and also help to spread tears and lubricating solutions over the eyeballs. When you blink your eyelids, of course, you are spreading those lubricating fluids across the surface of the eye. The upper eyelid is more movable than the lower eyelid. And have you ever experienced a twitching of your eyelid? So that involuntary quivering is very similar to muscle twitches that you may have in your arm or your foot or your leg or any other body part. Excuse me. So twitches are usually harmless. There's not anything major going on. They usually only last for a few seconds. They can become quite annoying though when they last for a few minutes, but they usually go away on their own. And you may find that they happen more often when you are stressed or fatigued. So if you're experiencing a lot of eyelid twitches, chill out for a little bit. Hopefully that will take care of it and it will go away. The conjunctiva is a thin mucous membrane that's composed of epithelial cells with a whole lot of goblet cells. And the conjunctiva is going to cover the sclera or the white part of the eye, but not the cornea, the thin part. The thin clear part that we'll see in a few minutes. So a lot of times you may have some swollen blood vessels. The eye becomes blood clot or becomes bloodshot as those blood vessels dilate and get congested that are a part of the conjunctiva. This can happen because of irritation, infection, or simply because we're tired and the eyes become dry. The eyebrows, of course, and the eyelashes are going to be protective structures for the eye. So the eyelashes project off the borders of each of the eyelids, and the eyebrows sit transversely above the eyelids and protect the eyeballs from things that would normally get into the eyes. Think about when you're sweating. Your forehead is sweating, and some of that sweat gets trapped in your eyebrows, so that is protecting your eyes from getting that sweat in them. But it also helps to protect your eyebrows and eyelashes, help to protect the eyeballs from the direct rays of the sun. You have sebaceous glands at the base of the hair follicles in the eyelashes, and these secrete a lubricating fluid into the follicles. If you should get an infection in one of these glands, usually caused by a bacteria, it can cause a very painful, pus-filled, swollen area that we call a stye. The lacrimal apparatus is a group of structures that produces and drains lacrimal fluid, or what we commonly just call tears. We're going to see a little bit more about that in a few minutes when we look at the actual structures that make up that lacrimal apparatus on the next slide. So we'll go ahead and mention those extrinsic eye muscles. So the eye sits, of course, as you know, in the bony depressions of the skull that we call the orbits. The orbits are bony structures that help to protect the eye and to stabilize them within the cranium. It also helps to anchor them to the muscles that help to move the eyes. So there are 6 sets of muscles that are capable of moving the eye in almost any direction. Alright, so let's look briefly at the lacrimal apparatus. As I mentioned, these are the glands and the ducts that produce the tears or the lacrimal secretions, lacrimal fluid that covers and keeps the eye moist. So the lacrimal glands, as you see here, above the eye, so located between the upper eyelid and the eyebrow, are going to secrete the lacrimal fluid through ducts that empty those tears onto the surface of the conjunctiva, okay, so the covering of the eye. The ducts carry this fluid onto the surface of the eyeball, and of course the eyelids move that fluid around, spread it across the eyeball as we blink. Now, some of that fluid is going to collect in the lower parts of the eye and here in the corner of the eye and go into little structures called canaliculi. So canaliculi are simply very, very small little ducts. So these ducts are going to carry the lacrimal fluid into a lacrimal sac that empties into the nasal cavity. This can, of course, this passageway can be blocked by infection, and instead of the tears getting down into the nasal mucosa and mixing with the mucus, that infection can cause a blocking of those ducts that may have to be drained. Sometimes simply taking antibiotics can clear that up. So the lacrimal glands are innervated by parasympathetic fibers of the facial nerves. The fluid produced by these glands is very watery, so tears, contains salt and some mucus, but also lysozyme, which is a protective bacterial enzyme that helps to destroy bacteria that may get into the eye. So these fluids protect and clean and lubricate and moisten the eyeball. Normally, we clear away tears as fast as we produce them because the eyeball is exposed to the external environment and evaporation occurs. Other times, of course, the fluid's just going to pass down those lacrimal canals and down into the nasal cavity. If something does cause the eye to become irritated, especially the conjunctiva, the lacrimal glands may be stimulated to over-secrete and tears accumulate, and we call that watery eyes. This can occur in response to something that is an irritant, but also inflammation of the nasal mucosa, like what happens when we get a cold or we have a sinus infection, and that, of course, again obstructs the ducts that drain the nasolacrimal glands, and it blocks those tears from being able to pass down into the nasal cavity. So that blocks the drainage of the tears, and again, we develop watery eyes. So you may be wondering, well, why do we cry when we feel bad, when we're upset, when we're happy? Only humans express emotions, whether happy, sad, or in pain by crying. In response to parasympathetic stimulation, okay, now remember the nervous system controls our emotions, the lacrimal glands then start to produce excess lacrimal fluid that spills over the edges, and that's what we call crying. When that happens, of course, some of that excess fluid, the excess tears, are going to fill the nasal cavity, and that's why we get a runny nose when we cry as well. All right, so remember we just talked about the connection between the eyes and the nasal cavity, where those nasolacrimal ducts, of course, are going to empty tears down into the nasal cavity, and we get a runny nose when we cry. I found this years and years ago. Originally saw it when it aired on David Letterman, and I thought this would be an appropriate place to show you this, which really illustrates the connection between the nasal cavity and the eyes. All right, watch and enjoy.
Okay, I'll be right over here. Here we go. Bring it in. Oh. He's got a... Oh.
Yep, he's spraying milk out of his eyeballs. Just one more look. You get to see it again in slow motion. Sorry for the quality, it is an old video, but I still wanted to share it. Yeah, sorry, I thought that was pretty cool. I wanted to share it with you. Okay, so back to the real stuff, right? So we go from shooting milk through the eyeballs, from the nose through the eyeballs, into the muscles that move the eye. So we looked at these, or we mentioned how these 6 muscles are able to move the eye in almost any direction. So here you can see an image that shows you where those muscles are located. Now, I certainly don't want you spending your time learning all of these muscles right now, just to understand where they are and what they do. They're muscles that are going to move the eyeball in different directions. This allows you to look to the left, look to the side, look up, look down, and many other eye movements without having to move the head. In addition to this, you can also see in this sagittal section of the eyeball, you can see the optic nerve. So that is going to be, of course, the connection between the eyeball and the brain. You can see the lens, which is going to bring light into and change the shape of that light as it comes into the eyeball. You can see the iris of the eye, so that's what gives us the color of the eye. What else can we see here? Oh, you can see the opening, which is the pupil that light comes through. You can also see the eyelids, the upper and the lower, the eyelashes, the eyebrow, the cornea, which is that transparent covering over the iris, and you can see the white of the eye, which is the sclera. The adult human eyeball is about 1 inch in diameter. Most of its total surface area is going to be inside the orbit, so only about 1/6 of the eye is exposed. The remainder, of course, being inside that orbit, is protected by that bony structure. The wall of the eyeball consists of 3 layers, 2 tunics, and the retina. So the fibrous tunic is the more superficial layer of the eyeball. Remember, we've talked about fibrous tissue before and how it's usually going to be the outside of something and very protective. You'll see this in anatomy too when you look at the protective layers of several body structures. The fibrous layer is always going to be the outermost layer, or almost always will be that outermost protective layer. Connective tissue fibers lend protection to a structure, right? Helps to anchor it in place and also protect from external and internal forces. So the fibrous tunic is the most superficial layer of the eyeball. It consists of the front part of the cornea, and the anterior part of the fibrous tunic is the cornea. The posterior part is the sclera. So the cornea is transparent, and it's a covering over the colored part of the eye, the iris. Because the cornea is curved, it helps to focus light onto the retina, which we'll see in just a few minutes. The sclera means hard. Okay, so the hard, not really hard, but harder part of the eye is the white part of the eye, and it is a layer of very dense connective tissue with a whole lot of collagen fibers and fibroblasts. The sclera covers the entire eyeball except for the cornea. Now remember, the cornea is the clear part that covers the iris, the colored part. So the sclera gives shape to the eyeball and makes it a little more rigid and protects its inner parts. So remember, sclera means hard, so more rigid and protective. It also serves as the attachment point for a lot of those muscles that we just saw with the eye. The vascular tunic is the second of the tunics or layers of the eyeball, and it's sometimes called the uvea, U-V-E-A. Okay, so the uvea or the vascular tunic is composed of a choroid, a ciliary body, and an iris. So the choroid is very highly vascularized, and it's going to line the internal surface of the sclera. We'll see these in an image in just a moment. Okay, so actually let's go ahead and get to that image, but just to recap before we go, the vascular layer or the vascular tunic, also called the uvea, consists of the three parts: the choroid, the ciliary body, and the iris. So if we move to this image, you can see I've highlighted several structures in here, including the ones that we're just talking about. So the choroid is very, very highly vascular. Okay, so here you can see the choroid layer. You can also see the cornea, the pupil, the iris, the lens, some of the cavities. Here you see the ciliary body, which has these little muscular structures that are going to attach to the iris. You can see fluid-filled chambers here and here. There's your pupil, the cornea covering the iris, of course, which is the colored part. All right, so let's get back to this. So the choroid is very highly vascular, lines the internal surface of the sclera. In the anterior part of the vascular tunic, the choroid becomes a structure called the ciliary body. The ciliary body consists of processes and a ciliary muscle. That ciliary muscle is a circular band of smooth muscle that can contract or relax, and as it does so, the fibers change, and that alters the shape of the lens and helps us to adapt our vision for seeing things that are close or seeing things that are farther away. The iris means rainbow, is the colored part of the eyeball, also remember a part of the vascular tunic. So the iris is sort of like a flat donut. It's between the cornea and the lens and attached to the ciliary process. It contains melanocytes, remember, melanocytes give color, and circular smooth muscle fibers. The amount of melanin that's in the iris determines your eye color. So the eyes appear really dark, brown or black, if the iris contains a lot of melanin. It appears blue when there's very little melanin, and green, somewhere in the middle. So the more melanin, the darker the eye. The less melanin, the lighter the eye. And of course it's the iris that we refer to with eye color. All right, principal function of the iris is to regulate the amount of light that enters the eyeball through the pupil. Well, you may wonder, why is it called a pupil? Pupil means little person. That's because when you look into someone else's eyes, you see a reflection of yourself in the pupil. So the pupil is the hole in the center of the iris. So when bright light stimulates the eye, the circular muscles of the iris contract and causes a decrease or constriction in the size of the pupil. So that allows less light into the eye. In dim light, those muscles are going to relax, causing the iris to expand or the pupil to dilate, and that allows more light to get in. The third and inner layer of the eyeball is the retina, and it's the beginning of the visual pathway. This layer, the retina, can be viewed with a structure or a tool called an ophthalmoscope. So this is the instrument that your eye doctor shines that light into your eye, and that allows him to be able to look through the pupil and provide a magnified view of the retina and the blood vessels that are a part of it, but also the optic nerve. Remember, the optic nerve is responsible for our special sense of vision. So the surface of the area is the only place in the body where you can view, or using an ophthalmoscope, blood vessels can be examined directly without, of course, going into the body. So with that in mind, those vessels can be examined for pathological changes that may occur if you have high blood pressure, or diabetes mellitus, cataracts, or even age-related macular degeneration. So by looking into the eye, you can view the retina and those blood vessels and changes that may accompany some of those disorders. A part of the retina is the optic disc. So this is where the optic nerve fibers exit the eyeball. You can see that here. Here you can see a lot of those blood vessels that are going to supply the eye. Also, the retina has a pigmented layer and a neural layer. The pigmented layer helps to absorb stray light rays, and the neural layer is going to be responsible for sending nerve impulses to the axons that form the optic nerve. Also within, as I mentioned a while ago, you have that optic disc. So the optic disc is where the fibers of the optic nerve are going to exit the eyeball, and that is what we sometimes call the blind spot, because it doesn't contain any photoreceptors that we'll learn about in a few minutes that we call rods and cones. Because there are no receptors there, that is a blind spot, so no vision is processed there. The macula lutea is a flat yellowish looking spot at the exact center in the posterior part of the retina. A part of that, the fovea centralis, is a small depression at the center of the macula lutea, and it contains only cones. It also, fovea centralis, central focus, is the area of our best focus or highest acuity, where we have the best resolution and sharpness of our sense of vision. I wanted to pop back here to this image for just a moment to show you again where the retina is located. Of course, it's that inner lining of what we commonly think of as the eyeball. So that's the receptive area where light stimulus is going to be received and processed. You may have heard of someone having a detached retina. That usually occurs due to trauma, for instance, a blow to the head, a traffic accident, but also some types of eye disorders such as age-related macular degeneration or other types of eyeball degeneration. The detachment usually occurs between the neural layer and the pigmented layer of the retina, and that allows fluids of the eyeball to accumulate between these layers and forces the retina to sort of push outward. This results in, of course, the light rays coming in not being focused properly on the retina and can give us distorted vision and perhaps even blindness in that particular field of vision. The retina may be reattached, though, by laser surgery or cryosurgery, so applying extreme cold to the area. But the reattachment needs to happen very quickly in order to avoid permanent damage to that retina. All right, so let's move back where we were and talk just a little bit about the photoreceptors that are a part of vision. So photoreceptors in the retina are very specialized cells that process the light rays that are eventually going to be converted into nerve impulses. So there are two types of photoreceptors, rods and cones. Rods allow us to see in dim light, such as when it's dark outside and there's a little moonlight. But because these rods don't provide color vision in dim light, we only see black and white and shades of gray, right? Brighter light stimulates photoreceptors called cones, which produce color vision. We have three types of cones that are, remember, these are all photoreceptors in the retina. We have blue cones, which are sensitive to blue light, green cones that are sensitive to green light, and red cones, yeah, you guessed it, they're sensitive to red light. So everything else, what we think of as color vision, results in the stimulations of many different combinations of these three types of cones. Now these photoreceptors, of course, are receptors, just like we've seen in other areas of the body, and they are going to be stimulated by those light rays coming in. They are then going to stimulate other nerve cells in a neuronal pathway that ends with neurons whose axons exit the eyeball as the optic nerve in that pathway to the brain. As we start talking about vision and how light passes into the eye, we need to learn a few more structures. So here, of course, we have the iris, the colored part of the eye, and the opening between that is going to be the pupil. So behind the pupil and the iris, within the cavity of the eyeball, we find the lens. So the cells of the lens have proteins that are arranged like the layers of an onion. Normally, all of the structures of the lens are perfectly transparent, and there's no blood vessels in the lens, so light passes through the lens with no obstruction. The lens helps to focus images on the retina so that we have clear vision. The lens divides the interior part of the eyeball into two cavities, the anterior cavity, okay, so we see here anterior, and the vitreous chamber. The anterior cavity is filled with aqueous humor. That simply means water. It's a transparent watery fluid that nourishes the lens and the cornea, keeps them very moist. The larger posterior cavity of the eyeball is called the vitreous chamber. So it's between the lens and the retina. Remember, the retina is that inner lining of photoreceptors. Within the vitreous chamber, we have what is sometimes called the vitreous body or vitreous fluid. So it's sort of a transparent, sort of jelly-like substance that pushes against the retina and holds it against the choroid, so the retina has an even surface for receiving those images as those light rays come in. So the vitreous humor makes up about 4/5 of the eyeball. It also helps to maintain intraocular pressure within the eye, and that is produced by the vitreous humor and the aqueous humor. So the aqueous, remember, is in the anterior part or the anterior cavity. The vitreous humor is in that posterior and larger vitreous chamber back here. So that pressure is normally about 16 millimeters of mercury. Now, that's the same measurement that's used to measure blood pressure. Intraocular pressure helps to maintain the shape of the eyeball by basically keeping it filled like a water balloon. Keeps the eyeball from collapsing. Anything that causes a puncture wound to the eyeball, though, can lead to the loss of these fluids, and that decrease in intraocular pressure can allow the retina to detach, and of course that can lead to blindness. So what's happening here? When light rays come in, they pass through the cornea, then through, okay, so through the cornea, then through the anterior chamber, through the posterior part of the anterior chamber, through the pupil, onto the lens, through the vitreous humor, and then reaches the retina. So coming up, we've got a few little tables that will help to explain these structures and what's going on with each of them as we process the sense of vision. So remember, we begin with the most external covering, that tunic that is going to admit light in, but also refracts or bends that light as it comes in. So when light waves travel through a transparent substance, such as the air around us, and then pass into a second transparent substance, the water in the eyes, those light rays bend or refract. So this is what we call refraction. So as light enters the eye, light rays are refracted, by the cornea, the surface of the lens, and also, of course, as those light rays travel through the humors, and then they come into exact focus once that fluid, or once those light rays reach the retina. So about 75% of total refraction of light rays happens at the cornea, with the remaining about 25% of the focusing power and changes to focus happen because of the lens. That lens changing allows us to change the way that light rays come in if we are focusing on distant or near objects, and that's accommodation that we'll look at in just a moment. Okay, squirreled for a moment, let's get back to vision. So light comes in, light rays come in through the cornea, which allows the light to enter, but also bends and refracts that. Now there's a few more structures on here, such as the sclera and others, that really don't change the light, but also a part of those supporting structures. The iris, of course, is going to, because of the ciliary body, will become larger and smaller, and that changes the shape of the iris, or changes the size of the pupil to allow more or less light to come in. Those light rays, of course, are going to travel through the humors, and as they do so, be further refracted until they are received onto the photoreceptors of the retina. Those photoreceptors of the retina are going to be responsible for helping to change or convert those nerve impulses, those potentials, into electrical activity that the brain can process. So that, of course, is where the optic nerve is going to pick up that stimulus and take it to the brain. A little bit more information here. You can see the cavities and the lens again. So I put this in here just because it gives you a pretty good overview and summary of these structures and what they're doing. Axons of cells from the retina form the optic nerve, which provides output from the retina to the brain. Axons from these nerves are going to cross over where the optic nerves form the optic chiasma. So the optic chiasma, remember when we looked at structures of the brain, and we also looked at the bones, and we saw the optic canal, the optic nerve crosses over right there at the pituitary gland and also at the sella turcica, and forms that X-like structure, the optic chiasma. Where that happens, some of the axons cross over to the opposite side of the brain, but others remain uncrossed. So from the left eyeball, some of the fibers cross over and go to the right side of the brain, but some continue back to the occipital lobe of the same side of the brain. Everything that can be seen by one eye is called that eye's field of view, or visual field. Because the eyes are located on the anterior part of our heads, we have a lot of visual field overlap. So that's what we call binocular vision, because of that overlap of the field of view of those two eyes. So the visual field of each eye is divided into two regions: the nasal or central half, okay, toward the nose, and the temporal or peripheral half, toward the sides. Vision from the right half of each visual field is conveyed to the left side of the brain, and visual information from the left half of each visual field is conveyed to the right side of the brain. So we have that crossing over of this information that allows both sides of the brain to process both fields of view. Now, before you get too tied down in all this, just remember, you've got axons coming from the right eyeball and the left eyeball. Some of those stay on the same side of the brain as they travel back to the visual fields. Some of them cross over and go to the other side. So that allows both eyeballs to collectively together process visual stimulus. So those neuronal pathways from the optic tract, the optic nerves, are going to lead back to the primary visual areas and to the visual association areas in the occipital lobe. There are smaller areas also in the parietal and temporal lobes that help to process visual stimulus as well, and to make sense of it, to relate it to things that we know. Now that we've seen the basic pathway for getting that stimulus from the eyeball back to the brain, let's talk a little bit about some things that happen as we're doing something with all that stimulus, right? So we're using our sense of vision. So when the eye is focusing on an object that's close to you, the lens becomes more curved, and that causes a greater refraction or bending of those light rays. This increase in the curvature of the lens for things that are near to us or near vision is called accommodation. The near point of vision is the minimum distance from the eye that an object can be clearly focused on with maximum accommodation. That's usually about 4 inches in the young, healthy adult. So how does this accommodation occur? When you're looking at something that is distant, the ciliary body, the muscles of the ciliary body are relaxed and the lens is flatter because it's stretched in all directions. When you view an object that's up close, the ciliary muscle contracts. That pulls the choroid and the ciliary process forward toward the lens and releases the tension of the lens. Because the lens is elastic, it becomes more spherical, more rounded, and that increases its focus power and causes greater convergence of the light rays. So the lens and the lens changes shape because of the pulling of those muscles and allows us to focus differently on distant versus near structures. All right, so we have normal vision and then we have abnormal vision. So most of you know someone that wears glasses or contact lens to correct their vision. So the normal eye can refract light rays pretty much perfectly from a distance of about 20 feet. The image is going to be focused clearly on the retina, but many people can't do that. So when you hear of 20/20 vision, that means your vision at 20 feet is what perfect vision of someone or someone with perfect vision can see at 20 feet. However, not all vision is perfect. Some people have a condition called myopia, or more commonly nearsightedness. This occurs when the eyeball is too long in relation to the focusing power of the cornea and the lens, or when the lens is too thick, so much thicker than normal, so an image converges or focuses in front of the retina. People with myopia can see close images very clearly, but things that are far off or distant, not so much so. So nearsightedness means you can see clearly things that are near. Things that are far are going to be much blurrier. This can be corrected using a concave type lens that changes the way the light is focused before it hits the retina. Other people may have a condition known as hyperopia or farsightedness. So the eyeball length is short in relation to the focusing power of the cornea or the lens is thinner than normal, so the image converges behind the retina. People that are hyperopic can see distant things clearly, but not things up close. So they are farsighted. They can see far off, not up close. This is more of what happens as you age. However, this also can be corrected using eyeglasses that have a convex lens that changes the way the light is refracted. Another disorder associated with the way that light is refracted is called astigmatism. So this can be when either the cornea or the lens has an irregular curvature. As a result of this, parts of the image are out of focus, so vision is blurry or distorted. Now you'll do some tests to assess many of these in your lab course. And of course we do know that moved on too quickly there. Most of the errors associated with vision can be fixed by eyeglasses or contact lens, which are going to change the way that the light is going to focus onto the retina. So a contact lens is going to be sort of a fake lens that floats on top of a film of tears on top of the cornea. So the outer surface of the contact lens usually corrects the visual defect, and the posterior surface is going to match the curvature of the cornea so that it lies on that cornea comfortably. Some people wear contact lens very comfortably. Other people just quite never get used to them. I was one of those that never could. I always felt like something was irritating my eye. Eyeglasses change the way that the light comes into the eye, so it changes the refraction. As that light passes through that glass surface, it refracts differently, and that causes it to enter the eyeball and to focus correctly on the retina. There are surgical procedures, specifically LASIK, that involves reshaping the cornea to correct these refraction abnormalities. That is usually considered a permanent fix for the eyes. So during LASIK surgery, anesthetic drops are placed into the eyes, and a circular flap of tissue from the center of the cornea is cut. That flap is then folded out of the way, and the underlying cornea can be reshaped with a laser, one very tiny microscopic laser or layer at a time. Computers usually are going to assist the physician in being able to see and remove these very, very thin layers and resculpt the surface of the cornea. So after that's complete, the little flap is put back into position, a patch is placed over the eye for a day or two, and that flap quickly reattaches to the rest of the cornea, and in most cases the vision is corrected permanently.